Mr. Clinton Heylin.
Good evening, Donchester. It's great to be back in Pontefract. Tonight, it's going to be all things Fairport. It is the 50th anniversary of the release of What We Did on Our Holidays, an absolutely seminal album, and one that seems to grow in stature year on year on year. So we're going to play that off my hopefully pristine American pressing with a different cover and a different back cover, but still the same content. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the section on What We Did on the Holidays from the book. We're going to play the album, and then after that we're going to take a break. You can top up your refreshments, and then we'll come back. We'll have a question and answer session. If you don't ask questions, we'll make one up. So I'd advise you to ask them while you have the chance. They don't have to be restricted to 1968 Fairport Convention or What We Did on the Holidays, but it'll help. And of course, we'll have a signing session as well, hopefully, and everyone will have a good time. So we'll take you back. It's the last week in May 1968, and Fairport Convention have been functioning as a touring, gigging band for a year. In keeping with Fairport's unbelievably complicated history, in that year they'd released one album, 2 singles, and already gone through two lineup changes. Technically 3, actually, because the drummer at the first gig never played again. As I say, in keeping with the tradition, they were already fathering port confusion. But at the end of May 1968, Sandy Denny joins the band. And most people would consider that to be the beginning of the great classic era of Fairport. And within the space of 2.5 years, they will release 4 of the great albums of English rock, English folk rock: What We Did on the Holidays, Unhalf Brickin', Legion Leaf, and Full House. Extraordinary output given the time period, and the fact that yet again they went through 4 lineup changes in the space of those 2.5 years. So, but that's where we come in. Sandy has joined the band, and suddenly everything is possible. Fortunately, at every turn, Richard Thompson, the one Fairport figure to whom even Sandy readily deferred, was determined to steer the band in ever more productive directions. When Fairport's frontman, Ian Matthews, penned a set of lyrics for an unexpected entry into the band's internal songwriting competition, it was Richard who turned it into a song, the book song. This is Ian Matthews. I saw myself being pushed a little into the background because Sandy was a songwriter. And What We Did on Our Holidays is when Richard blossomed as a songwriter. It was like the race had started and Richard came out of the blocks. He came out with all these songs, and they weren't simple songs. They weren't straightforward songs. And I think that probably jolted me into action, realising the future lay in being a songwriter as much as a singer. There was no more just being a singer in the band. At that point, I started trying to write lyrics, and I came up with the book song. I took the lyric to Richard because we all lived in the house in Brent at that point, and he liked them enough to put the music to them. I realised that being a lyricist was not going to be enough. I needed to learn to play an instrument. I went to Richard and said, "Will you show me some stuff?" He helped me choose a guitar, and that was the beginning of me becoming a songwriter. For all her bluster, Sandy remained reluctant to show her own wares in the song department, and she certainly had some, preferring to keep all she'd stockpiled over the past 2 years under the nearest bushel. It meant there would be as many Ian Matthews and Ashley Hutchins compositions as Denny originals on Fairport's sophomoric album. Yet it was Sandy's Fotheringay, a song penned pre-Fairport, that drew the most comment, perhaps because it was quite a statement. Inhabiting the same quasi-traditional domain Patrick Colum consciously emulated on She Moved Through the Fair, Fotheringay is told from the vantage point of an imprisoned Mary Queen of Scots awaiting execution at the behest of her cousin Elizabeth I, whom of course she never met if you go and see that movie. The song's sheer originality convinced Fairport to make it side one, track one, but it would be Sandy's last songwriting contribution for now. However, there was little collective resistance backstage when one night Sandy began playing a song from her folk club repertoire, the quasi-traditional Irish perennial She Moved Through the Fair. Soon enough, Fairport, its male singer accepted, began to busk along. Ian Matthews again. It was a rude awakening for me. We got to a show shortly after Sandy joined, and they were rehearsing in the dressing room. It was a traditional song, and I was in shock because I couldn't see a place for myself in it. It wasn't a song that needed harmony, and I wasn't playing anything. I think that was the moment I realised that I was going to have to rethink this thing and try and figure out where I fitted into it. I realised that there was a shift going on, even though it was never talked about. The folk club standard was, as Ashley notes, basically Sandy's working arrangement. She had sung that in clubs by herself, and when she sang it for us, we just slotted in around her. It sounds simple enough, but it actually required the band to mute its proclivity to rock out. Fortunately for Fairport, it devolved to Richard to set the example. But where this era of Fairport really announced itself during the second half of 1968 was in other original songs. If the formative efforts at songwriting on their debut album had been hastily sidelined, with the exception of It's Alright Ma, It's Only Witchcraft, and I recommend Slade's version of that song. I'm not making that up, they really did do a version of it. Ashley continued to push for more original material from all parties. At this stage, everyone was expected to pitch in, because no one in Fairport could yet be considered prolific, certainly not Sandy, who admitted she never found it easy to write, but Ashley made it clear he expected members of his band to write songs. If her songs were still usually tailored to her folk voice, Tiger, i.e. Ashley, now came up with one of Fairport's rockiest workouts, the compelling Mr. Lacey, all his own work. As Ian says, Tiger wrote this song about this crazy professor who had 3 robots. Then Tiger said, I'm bringing him down to play the solo. And it turned out that the solo really was 3 robots walking about making that noise. It was the one real opportunity on Fairport's Ireland debut for Richard to cut loose. Though once again, the real McCoy is the BBC version. Perhaps surprisingly, Ian was allowed to deliver the main vocal, although by his own admission, on the more ballsy stuff, I would never dream of presuming the lead. I would always let Sandy have it. And in concert, Sandy did get to do her Empress of the White Blues thing on Muddy Waters' You're Gonna Need My Help Someday. But although it was recorded twice for the BBC, it was probably too bluesy for Boyd, who had worked with Muddy Waters, to green-light it for the album. He had his own prejudices to overcome on this front. Perhaps Sandy was still not sure her other originals suited the group sound. Even Fotheringay was essentially a solo performance over which the band spun a pretty web of sound. Nor did it easily slot into the regular live set to vie with I'll Keep It With Mine, her other vocal tour de force on What We Did on Our Holidays. Because, for all its eclecticism, the second album was almost as unrepresentative of Fairport live as their Polydor debut. The likes of Morning Glory, Jack of Diamonds, Suzanne, Reno, Nevada, all survived the switch in singers from Judy Dybel to Sandy and remained a key part of their performances. While of the 8 songs they performed live on Dutch TV and at the Royal Festival Hall's Festival of Contemporary Song in September 1968, just 2, I'll Keep It With Mine and Mr. Lacey, feature on the album. Suzanne, the set closer at the Festival Hall, would not be so memorialised. Nor would another outstanding Fairport interpretation of a Leonard Cohen song, Bird on the Wire. Someone was consciously steering the recorded band in a diametrically different direction to the one its audience delighted in. That person was their producer-manager, delighted by the shape-shifting Sandy spawned. This is Joe Boyd. When the band is recording a record that is basically Judy Dybel singing a Joni Mitchell song, you may end up making a pleasant record, but you're not actually going anywhere. But then, when you have Sandy writing new songs, Richard writing new songs, stimulated and challenged by Sandy, the first steps in various directions become real interesting steps, rather than just a lack of direction. Boyd had always felt there was more to come from the diffident Thompson. Second time around, he was proven right. The guitarist, rising to the challenge, raised the stakes on his fellow Fairporters and put some songwriting distance between him and them, with the 3 originals, No Man's Land, Tale in a Hard Time and Meat on the Ledge, which collectively delineated a unique brand of doom and gloom. Of these, just Meat on the Ledge was transferred to the live set, a concession that Thompson quickly came to regret. He had unwittingly provided Fairport with its first anthem. Simon Nicol thinks the song was recorded at Morgan Studios because there was some piece of equipment that John Wood, who's been here of course, wanted to get his hands on. The result, Nicol recalls, didn't impress him, nor did Richard think much of it. And yet, much to the songwriter's growing annoyance, it was asked for at every gig, which is perhaps why Meat on the Ledge was denied its obvious spot, the album closer. That honour went instead to an odd piece of whimsy from Simon, the instrumental End of a Holiday, his one song credit on a collection where everyone in the band pitched in. From now on, there would be a surfeit of quality material for the band to draw on. At a November 1968 BBC session, Sandy came up with another compositional curveball, Autopsy, too late for consideration. But evidence that Ashley's insistence on a contribution was encouraging her to raise her own game. As Ashley says, we gave her Richard, not only as a guitarist, but also as a benchmark to write against. It pushed her on. If the band continued to treat Sandy with kid gloves, her waspish producer seemed determined to accord her star billing on an album the band had made collectively, excluding many of the vehicles on which Ian Matthews was the primary vocal, of which Richard Farina's Reno, Nevada was most unforgivable. Boyd gave Sandy the only 3 solo vocals on What We Did on Our Holidays: Fotheringay, She Moved Through the Fair, and her sublime reinterpretation of I'll Keep It With Mine. Her faultless renditions of this unreleased Dylan song and wholly unreleased Joni Mitchell song, Eastern Rain, retain the last tenuous link to the band's original England's answer to Jefferson Aeroplane conceit. From this point forward, a finer balance between high-quality originals and cleverly arranged covers would become the norm. And with that shift, Ian's chances of redressing any growing vocal imbalance was fatally curtailed. The real memorial for his time in Fairport, and especially those unerring interpretations of American singer-songwriters, would be a collection of 1968 Fairport radio sessions, actually compiled on cassette in 1975 for mail order only. The Heyday cassette consciously features songs recorded by the What We Did on a Holidays lineup only, and just like the live sets, it was 3/4 covers. In the same 6 months Fairport spent making What We Did on Our Holidays, they effectively recorded an entirely different album in a handful of afternoons at the BBC. And it may well be more representative of this heyday. In fact, as a mea culpa, Boyd wrote in his notes to its first official release, "I'm now forced to admit it is hard to find an American band who can do these songs equal justice." Many would mourn the loss of this Fairport down the years, yet theirs was a natural development, the same one which had changed the Stones, the Who, the Kinks from interpreters to creators. The key difference, aside from record sales, was that those bands saw themselves as pop artists whose hit singles charted their progress. For Fairport, singles were an afterthought at best. The idea that you could have rock and roll with very strong lyrics still served as the main spur on Thompson's creativity, while the Byrds numbers, Dylan numbers and Joni Mitchell numbers were increasingly viewed as a means to an end. And that end, as far as RT was concerned, was to achieve a style of our own. Okay. Without ruining the ending, the album comes out on, I think, January the 29th, 1969, and Ian has been sacked from the band within a month. So there would be no sequel. It really was a once-in-a-lifetime alliance. But for a band that lasted about 8 months, it is pretty extraordinary that they managed to produce 2 albums as good as What We've Done on Our Holidays and Heyday. I do recommend those who don't already own Heyday or Fairport Convention at the BBC to try and track down the original track listing for Heyday, because the hugely bloated, overexpanded Island CD is an absolute atrocity, and has nothing to do with the original Ashley album. So worth seeking out. Anyway, we're going to play What We've Done on Holidays, which is not Heyday, but is a truly, truly great album. And then we'll have some drinks and questions, and we'll make an evening of it. Thank you.
Can I make an observation first? I think you read really nicely tonight, and it makes you so sad about Ian Matthews having been there for the first album and then working on the second album. And I think he thought that he was in Fairport Convention forever, but he wasn't, and it seems right sad. Just at the point when he started writing his own songs as well.
Well, of course, one of the extraordinary things about Fairport, particularly in the classic years, is how many lineup changes they go through. I mean, and their ability to reinvent themselves. Yeah. I mean, none of the classic albums are made by the same lineup. Yeah. Which is bizarre. I always use the analogy. They were accused at the time of being England's answer to Jefferson Airplane, but they're really England's answer to the band.
I think so.
But the band produced nothing like the body of work. 2 wonderful classic albums in the space of 15 months, and then very bitty albums, and long gaps between the albums. Whereas Fairport, in the same period, turned out 5 really top-notch albums, but each one of those requires that they reinvent themselves, and I think that's really what happened. And unfortunately, in reinventing themselves, in every single case, there were casualties. I think, obviously, I don't know how many of you were here for Ian's thing, but I actually think in Ian's case they did him a favour, because he would always have lived in the shadow of Richard and Sandy. I don't see how else he could get around that. And as the book makes clear, the thing that people find strange, I suspect, is that given that Richard is the songwriter and the lead guitarist and one of the 2 or 3 greatest guitarists playing at that time, Sandy is this incredible songwriter and this incredible singer, and the leader of the band is the bass player. He's the guy that decides the direction until he leaves. You know, Ashley leaves after Legion leave. And one of the reasons I wrote the book is actually to highlight the staggering quality and quantity of Ashley's output in the first 3 to 4 years after he left the band. Because, you know, for those of you who grew up as I did, with Steel Eye Span being this kind of folk rock light version of Fairport, you know, who were on top of the pops and had hit singles. I never, you know, growing up, I never knew that they were the band that Ashley Hutchins formed. I never knew that they made this extraordinary album. I think an even better album than Legion Leave, Hark the Village Wait. And 2 more albums with Ashley in the space of 18 months before he left the band. So there are wonderful riches to be discovered in that catalogue. The No Roses album, for those who don't know it, the Albion Country Band album he made with his then wife Shirley Collins and Richard and half of Fairport and an amazing list of English folk rock musicians. Wonderful album. You know, he made 3 Steel Eye albums and No Roses and Morris On in the space of 2 years. You know, it's a really the sad thing about that, getting back to what you're saying, and ironically, is that the reason that he's churning these records out is actually part of his complete and total nervous breakdown that he had as a result of the road accident that Martin Lamble died in. He, of all of the members of Fairport, was the most traumatised. He was also the most physically damaged. He told me when we were talking about it, you know, even today, he can't sit in the front of a car if someone else is driving. You know, it's still, the scars are still there 50 years on. Out of that unbelievable tragedy, and as we were talking earlier, Martin was 19 years old when he died. Ashley produced this extraordinary body of work. So you know, it's great to have an opportunity to celebrate what Fairport did in those first 5 years, but also what some of the lights then went on to do in the next 5 years. I mean, the output of Richard, Sandy, Ashley, Ian in the next 5 years, if you look at the list of records, it's just truly extraordinary.
I'll ask you my question.
I'm sorry. I haven't actually got time for any questions.
It's just a quick one. You can answer it with a yes or no, really. In that Richard Thompson song on here, Tailing Hard Time, there's an anagram of Tim Harding. Do you think that's a coincidence?
Who knows?
We were talking about this the other day. Right in the middle of it, it's Tim Harding.
Yeah, well, of course, Unhalf Bricking is an acrostic. You know, they delighted in word games. All of the members of the band, and it was one of just to show how erudite and undruggy the band was when they were driving back in the back of the van after gigs. Yeah, they weren't shooting up, they were doing the Times crossword. So yeah, anything is possible.
Ian still does his puzzle books before his breakfast in the morning.
See? Yeah.
Has anyone else got?
All for people with their hands up. Well, one person. Richard?
Right, I did give you prior warning of this question, Clinton. If there hadn't been the car accident that killed Martin Lamble and Richard's girlfriend, Jean Franklin, was it?
Yeah, Jeannie.
Jeannie Franklin, who was celebrated in Jack Bruce. Yeah. What do you think would have happened to Fairport for the rest of the year? I mean, certainly, I can answer one bit myself. Richard wouldn't have married Linda, so that's. But what do you think would have happened to the band musically?
Well, I mean, as we were discussing earlier, Richard, I mean, the first point to say is that Unhalf Bricking, wonderful an album as it is an unfinished album. You know, it's like Pearl, the Janis Joplin album, which was never finished. You know, it was put out as an unfinished album and went straight to number one. But when she died, you know, the album was still a work in progress, and the same is true of Unhalf Bricking. I mean, I personally don't believe that they would have ended up with three Bob Dylan songs, on that album, if you know they'd have got to complete that album. And of course, they left Dear Landlord off the album. Whether their direction would have been as obvious as it appears to be, with the benefit of hindsight, you know, I mean, A Sailor's Life stands out on that album because of what they go on to do. Whether they would have gone in that direction, I think it's very difficult to say. You know, the few live tapes that exist of that band between the release of What We Did on the Holidays and the crash don't indicate any huge shift in direction. And as I say in the book, A Sailor's Life is really a logical continuation of what they were doing already with Reno, Nevada, the Richard Farina song, with East West, and with other guitar extemporizations. It takes a lot to laugh, takes a train to cry. So, which they were doing an amazing version of. If those who haven't heard the 1971 Ian Matthews version of it with Richard, should definitely track down the new Cherry Red box set when it comes out, just for that 6.5 minute version of It Takes a Lot to Laugh. It's an astonishing performance from Richard, and it's exactly the way they used to do it in Fairport. So I suspect they would have gone more in that direction than the English folk rock. It may be slight heresy, but as I state in the book, I have always had serious reservations about Legion Leave. I think it's half a great success. I think it's half a hugely important breakthrough, and I think half of it is a train wreck. The decision to pick weak traditional material like Renaudine over things like Ballad of Easy Rider, over Open the Door Homer, which we heard earlier with Richard singing it, over Down in the Flood, over a lot of the things they did record when they were working on Legion Leave that were much more based on the traditional Fairport. I think that they went to another extreme, and I think that wouldn't have happened. I think it would have been a gradual evolution, but we'll never know.
Seeing as we've got the leading authority on Bob Dylan in the house again, and not for the last time, can you just tell us about how they would have heard Give It To Me, and how they interpreted it? Would they have known about I'll Keep It With Mine? Would they have known who it was about at that time?
They wouldn't have known about Dylan and Nico. I don't think there's any way, for those who don't know. Dylan wrote the song in Greece in June 1964 when he was living in a little B&B with this woman that he'd met in Paris, Nico. And he gave her the song, which is why he never recorded it seriously. So they wouldn't have known that. All of the Dylan unreleased songs that they recorded in that classic period came from Joe Boyd. They all came because of his contacts in music publishing. So all of the basement tape material, all of the Whitmark demos, Percy's song, which ends up on Half Bricking, is a Whitmark demo. I'll Keep It With Mine is a Whitmark demo. All of that material would have come through Joe. And the irony of it is, and don't quote me on this, but Fairport were kind of careless with those tapes. And a lot of the stuff that got bootlegged subsequently of that material came in directly because Fairport themselves were fairly careless with the material.
You know we're recording this, don't you?
But likewise with the Joni Mitchell material, obviously we heard Eastern Rain on the album, and at that time they were one of the first acts to cover both sides. Now, and Night in the City, Marcy, all that material was because Joe knew Joni. He knew her from the Boston folk scene. So that all came through Joe Boyd. But as I indicated in the piece that I read, Joe at the same time was the guy that was pushing them away from that. He was the guy that was saying, don't do the American singer-songwriter stuff, or at least don't put it on your records.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So, how did this album, in fact, the band in general, how did they go down in the States?
Fairport, they didn't make it till 1970. They were due to go to America when they had the accident. They did, the tour was cancelled.
No, sorry, I meant how did they go down? How did the album do well in America?
The problem you have with the Fairport albums, and the one that we just listened to was the American version of the album, the problem is they were all released 6 months later. So you had a very bizarre situation where What We Did in the Holidays is coming out in America when Legion Leaf is coming out in England. Right. It's literally that extreme. And so they were playing catch up in America. They got well reviewed. There was a very vibrant American underground press at that point, not just Rolling Stone, you've got Fusion, you've got Cream, and Fairport were absolute critical darlings in America. Even Henry the Human Fly, Richard's first album, got good reviews in America.
Wow.
So that you had a very strange situation because Fairport only toured with the Full House lineup. They never toured with the Sandy Denny as the vocalist. And the next time that Richard plays America, Richard Thompson plays America, is 12 years later, and nobody knows what's going on because his wife keeps trying to break bottles over his head during the encore.
No, he played with Ian.
Oh, that's true. I mean, he did play as a backing musician, but yeah.
And after the crash, he went over with Sandy and Simon, and they did.
Well, yeah, supposedly got up and played at the Troubadour for 3 seconds, yeah. But
no, I think there's more.
It was what?
I thought there was more gigs.
No, they definitely no.
If you would have an argument, it was a man.
Oh no. They're literally, it was 3 songs at the Troubadour, and that was because they'd gone to A&M, which was their American label, in LA, just to say hi. A&M were picking up the tab for their trip to America, and it was just Sandy, Richard and Simon, and they got up at the Troubadour. That is definitely it.
There's a famous story though when Richard goes when Richard Thompson went with Ian Matthews and Andy Roberts, and they supported a soul review, and they got booed off. And Richard famously held up a dulcimer and said, contrary to your opinion, the saxophone is not your national instrument, this one is.
Well, yeah, and Richard, of course, confirmed that story was true. Richard did play as a backing musician, literally as a backing musician, on Ian Matthews and Sandy Denny's first solo tours after Fairport broke up. But there is no Richard and Lyndon never toured America till the final breakup, which is covered in wonderfully dramatic detail in the final chapter of this book, which ends with an absolute bang, quite literally, and the loud thud of something being smashed across Richard's cranium. Let me say, totally deservedly. There is absolutely no question he deserved what he got. But yeah, so that was when it all came crashing down. The battery's gone.
You have to shout up a bit.
You have to shout up.
Joe Boyd was managing and producing the Incredible String Band at the same time, who wrote all their own material and had very high chart positions. Fairport didn't seem to pick up on the fact that if you wrote more of your own songs, you'd make more money. That is, in a way, the beauty of this album tonight is that the covers are as good as the originals, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, they're totally different bands and totally different audiences. I mean, the Incredible String Band was certainly of their time.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no question about that. I actually take the opposite view, which I clearly state in the book, which is that Joe, not the band, Joe made a huge miscalculation, which was not to trade on their reputation as England's answer to Jefferson Airplane. I mean, Suzanne should have been released as a single. It would have been a hit, no question. And they did record it. The songs that they were doing in the set that people wanted to hear were not the songs, ironically, that end up on the album. I mean, they're touring at a time of what we've done, the Holidays and Half Bricking, and they're still playing stuff off the first album because that's what the fans wanted to hear. So, in a sense, the eclecticism of the band is part of the problem. That they appeal to everybody across the constituency, from psychedelia to whimsy, but at the same time they're impossible to categorise. I mean, the album that we just listened to, think about it, you know, you've got a Blind Willie Johnson song, you've got a Gene Ritchie traditional song, you've got a Patrick Cullum song, you've got 3 Richard Thompson songs, you've got, you know, there are so many hybrids on that album and so many diverse styles. I think part of the challenge of the album is really that it is too much to take in. And although it seems to be an album that people loved at the time, people aren't really sure what to do with it. And one of the huge miscalculations that was made, and it wasn't Fairport's fault and it wasn't Joe's fault, it was Chris Blackwell's fault, is that he stupidly put Meat on the Ledge as the closing track on the first Heylin sampler, which was called You Can All Join In. Now, I don't know how many of you have that album, but I don't know anybody who didn't have that album. And it was 54p or whatever the hell it was. It was a budget album. It was the price of a single. Well, if you put Meat on the Ledge out as a single and at almost exactly the same time put out an album which ends with Meat on the Ledge, and has Traffic on it, and has, you know, every act, John Martin on it, has, you know, Spencer Davis Group on it. I mean, a fabulous collection, and it's the same price as a single. You're not going to have a hit, are you, with Meat on the Ledge? Because everyone who had Meat on the Ledge had that album. And that was actually a big miscalculation, and I suspect cost them what could have been a big hit. I mean, Meat on the Ledge should have been a big hit.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Like I say, if you need anything signed, want to use those vouchers, do so now.
A friend of us all, Mr. Clayton Heylin. Thank you very much.